Well, thank you everyone for being here today. I'm delighted to be your host. This event is brought to you by my Green Lab. My name is Amira Ayoub. I am the head of Middle East and North Africa MENA programs at the World Green Building Council, and I'm delighted to be here with you today. I would like to welcome our panelists, James Connolly, the CEO for my Green Lab, and Elizabeth King, the President of Sustainable Finance and Chief Regulatory Officer for ICE. Welcome, Elizabeth. And Dr. Cristina Alonso Alija, the Head of ESG at Bayer. Welcome. At first, we will have a brief introduction presentation by James. So please, James, the floor is yours.
Great. And we're just going to start by giving a quick introduction to each of us and what our roles is at our company, and then I'm going to roll in to a presentation. It's actually a revision and update to a presentation that we released for the first time at COP26, measuring the overall progress of the industry on carbon emissions, as well as tracking progress to the UN Race to Zero Breakthrough Outcomes goal. So I'm James, I'm the CEO of My Green Lab, and My Green Lab's mission is to build a global culture of sustainability in science. In addition, My Green Lab is a delivery partner for the biotech and pharma sector in the Race to Zero. So we're actually working with them to track the industry's overall progress to net zero, as well as their short-term targets, the breakthrough outcomes, which is actually My Green Lab certification. So I'll get into that in a second, but I'm very excited to be here today, and I'll let the rest of the panelists introduce themselves.
Hello. I can use that one? I'll give back to you. Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me here. My name is Cristina Alonso, and I head ESG. Basically, I head sustainability, safety, health, and environment for the Bayer Group. So as you know, Bayer is an innovation company. We are active in the areas of health and nutrition. That means in agriculture, pharmaceuticals, for prescription drugs, and also OTC. We have a big number of scientists, and of course they are also asking us, what can we do for sustainability? What can we do for decarbonization? I'm myself a scientist, and I used to work in the lab. I started in the lab as a medicinal chemist, where I worked for many years at Bayer before moving on into new roles. So happy to be here.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here. I work for Intercontinental Exchange, or ICE. We are a technology company that owns 13 exchanges and 6 clearinghouses around the world, including the New York Stock Exchange, which is how most people know about us. For purposes of this panel, we own a large data business and have for a while in terms of the data for the financial industry. And building on that history, we've started to build out our sustainable finance data. So some of the data that is used by James in his report was provided by a company that we acquired in in July, that provides climate transition data.
Excellent. All right. Well, I'll kick it off then with a short presentation of the report that I mentioned, leveraging the data from ICE, which recently acquired Urgentum. Oh, you got, yeah, I guess, okay, yeah, you guys can come back. We'll come back after the panel. That's great. So the title of this talk today is The Carbon Impact of Biotech and Pharma, a Roadmap to 1.5 degrees C. And I think what was really exciting to me, for those of you who haven't been following the COP proceedings and those of us who have been here, is that this has really been deemed the implementation COP. We started out, actually, Simon Steele, the UNFCCC Executive Secretary, talking about 3 key themes, and one of those first themes was a transformational shift to implementation of the Paris Agreement, and how we actually put negotiations into concrete action. He said the litmus test of this and every future COP is how deliberations are accompanied by action. Everybody, every single day, everywhere in the world, needs to do everything they can to avert the climate crisis. And I thought that was an incredibly powerful call to action. Samri Shukri, the Egyptian Minister of Foreign Affairs and the COP27 president, I think really then put this into context around a vision for this COP to be about human needs, in particular how we're prioritizing those who are likely to be impacted by climate change the most, and also tend to have the least resources to deal with it. And I think those two things are really core to what My Green Lab does and why we're here at COP27 today. We really focus on turning commitment into action for our programs. My Green Lab's mission is to build a global culture of sustainability and science to transform the industry into a global leader on environmental sustainability. We do this through education, community engagement, and market-leading certification tools to inspire the scientific community to integrate sustainability into everything they do. Our vision is a world where all science is conducted in a way that benefits the health and well-being of people and our planet. And many of you may be aware, but I actually wasn't before I got involved with My Green Lab, laboratories are massively resource-intensive spaces. Labs use up to 10 times more energy than traditional commercial office spaces, 4 times more water, and they produce a huge amount of plastic and other hazardous waste. There was a study actually published in 2018 that showed that the biotech and pharma industry actually had 55% higher carbon emissions than the automotive industry. We looked into that. We were like, that's a really surprising and, in fact, sort of shocking finding, because you would think of the automotive industry as one of the largest carbon emitters in the world. We actually dug up the data that was behind that research study, and it was from the company that ICE actually acquired, Urgentum. That study only looked at scope 1 and 2. It didn't actually look across all 3 scopes of impact. So we knew we needed to do another study to understand the full scope of biotech and pharma, and I'm going to return to what scope 1, 2, and 3 are in just a second. And so what we found with this study was both a positive thing and I would say a negative thing. First, while the largest companies by revenue have continued to reduce scope 1, 2, and 3, actually 91% of the 75 companies that we evaluated classified as biotech and pharma don't have emissions targets aligned with a 1.5 degree world. So as I mentioned, this was the first study last year to look across all 3 scopes of impact. Scope 1, which includes the carbon emissions of fuel burned on site or in company vehicles, as well as the carbon emissions from purchased electricity, scope 2. You can kind of think of scope 1 and 2 as the things that are under your control as an organization. However, those are certainly not the extent of your impact. You need to look upstream into all the materials that you're purchasing, the impact of the transportation of those materials to your facility, as well as downstream and the impact of your products as they go out in the world and are used by your users. And it's only by looking across all 3 scopes do you get a complete picture of the overall carbon impact of an industry. So as I mentioned, we had some positive findings in this year's study when we looked actually across 6 years of data. So you can see up here on this chart, the blue and light green line are the top 15 companies and top 25 companies respectively. And what we're seeing is they're actually driving down scope 1 and 2 emissions on a yearly basis. For scope 3, the top 15 company and top 25 companies saw a significant spike in scope 3 emissions in 2016 and 2017, really when they first began to report in a meaningful way. But we've actually seen reductions since then, which is quite encouraging as well. However, when you look at a broader data set, 75 companies for which good data was available over the past 6 years, unfortunately, we're starting to see for scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions increase. They look pretty much flat for scope 3, but that's probably because most of the companies in that broader sector are not accurately reporting their scope 3 emissions yet. Some really positive things for the biggest companies, but overall as an industry, we clearly need to do better. Last year, we found that actually only 4% of companies within biotech and pharma had targets aligned with a 1.5 degree world, and only 41% of companies had any target at all. This year, that number increased a little bit. We had a significant, or a little bit more companies reporting, growing to 44%. But the really positive news is we actually grew to 9% of companies that have a target aligned with a 1.5 degree world. So moving from 4% to 9%, of course, that does mean that 91% of companies in this sector still don't have carbon targets aligned with a 1.5 degree world. So we still need to do better, particularly when we move past the top 15 and top 25 largest companies. We also found that overall the industry needs slightly more than a 9% year-on-year carbon reduction in order for biotech and pharma to be part of a 1.5 degree aligned scenario. That was up from last year's report, so the longer it takes us as an industry to address our carbon footprint, the faster and steeper reductions we need to make if we're going to avoid the worst impacts of global climate change. What we also found is overall, while we're seeing some positive trends with the largest companies, unfortunately, the total carbon output of the industry is still increasing. It grew 15% to 227 million tons of carbon emissions equivalent. And if you add in private companies, that increases the total carbon output by another 15% to 260. So last year, we had a conclusion that biotech and pharma actually has more overall carbon emissions than the semiconductor industry or the forestry and paper industry, two industries traditionally thought of as significant contributors to global climate change. We also found that biotech and pharma was about half the carbon emissions of the UK. That was sort of a cheeky conclusion because we were in Glasgow for COP26. You can't really compare industry sectors to countries, but I think it helps kind of understand the overall magnitude of this industry's impact. This year, while it went up, we actually saw telecommunications and semiconductors increase much faster than biotech and pharma, which was quite interesting. So while biotech and pharma's carbon emissions increased, semiconductors actually surpassed biotech and pharma, which I think is a good sign for biotech and pharma, but it maybe points to the need for us to look across industry sectors, particularly as biotech and pharma is taking more advantage of computing power and capacity. Next, we found that Scope 3 emissions are 4.3 times higher for public companies and 3.3 times higher for private companies. And so biotech and pharma, like many other industry sectors, has much more of their carbon impact in their Scope 3 than Scope 1 and 2. And so for us to understand and address the industry overall, we have to look across all three scopes. We actually think this number is low, however, meaning it's reported low. We think that as companies more accurately and more fully disclose their full Scope 3, that number is actually going to go up for this industry as well as for others. Then compared companies to each other. And we actually took all of the companies in that 75 company data set for which best data was available and lined them up in terms of their overall carbon impact. And what we found is that it was incredibly variable, both for Scope 1 and Scope 1 and 2, as well as for Scope 3. Scope 3 being even more variable. We think if companies begin to more accurately report, what we're going to see is they're going to line up more where those higher dots are. And so just to walk you through this chart, on the bottom line are Scope 1 and 2 combined, and then the dot, or the square, if you will, the gray square, is Scope 3. So we think most companies are still underreporting, and some of this data was inferred. So we actually think that the overall impact of the industry will increase as companies more accurately and consistently report their Scope 3 impact. One thing that we also found as well is that companies headquartered in Asia-Pacific region, primarily India and China, tended to have much higher Scope 1, 2, and Scope 3 emissions. And that's due to the fact that there's often dirtier energy grids, although that's improving. but also due to the fact that a lot of large biotech and pharma companies that have done a good job reducing their own impact are actually outsourcing a lot of their manufacturing, particularly for active pharmaceutical ingredients. Again, reinforcing the need to look across the entire scope of impact if we're going to drive change in the industry. You can't just reduce your impact by outsourcing it to another company, and in fact, that may increase the overall carbon output of the industry. Some really positive news, which I think is really exciting given the theme of the implementation COP here, is that 46% of the sector this year, by revenue, has committed to the race to zero. And that's up from 31% last year. So actually, biotech and pharma, as I'll show in a moment, is one of the leading industries in terms of committing to the race to zero. But commitments without action don't really make a difference. What's exciting in addition is that 53% of companies that have committed to the race to zero have now also committed to the UN breakthrough outcome, which is achieving My Green Lab certification for the majority of their labs at the highest level. So we're actually starting to see companies not only make progress on their commitments, but in implementing those commitments, and we're starting to see overall emissions reducing year on year, which is a very positive sign. When you look within Scope 3 emissions, there's two categories that tend to dominate for biotech and pharma. Purchased goods and services, as well as use of sold goods. And both private companies and public companies had a very similar Scope 3 profile. Use of sold products being 22 to 24%, purchased goods and services being 53 to 52%. So we really need to focus on purchasing and purchased goods and services if we're going to drive reductions in Scope 3. So just to sum up those findings, that while the largest companies by revenue have established goals and they're reducing impact for Scope 1, 2, and 3, 91% of companies analyzed do not have carbon emissions targets aligned with a 1.5 degree world. So we need companies to establish more ambitious targets, and they need to be backed up by measurable action. The total carbon impact of the industry has increased somewhat, 15%, and if we add in private companies, that's increasing as well, but it's not increasing as much as some other industry sectors, as I noted. And that Scope 3 emissions are a higher proportion, 4.3 times for public companies and 3.3 for private companies than Scope 1 and 2, with the majority coming from purchased goods and services. And then lastly, 46% of the sector by revenue has committed to the Race to Zero campaign, which is a significant increase. And of those companies, 53 are making progress on the Race to Zero breakthrough outcomes campaign. So My Green Lab certifications and tools are really designed specifically to drive carbon reductions, and one of the significant parts of a biotech and pharma's supply chain. So My Green Lab certification drives down carbon emissions in Scope 1 and 2 in research labs. That's why it was selected as a breakthrough outcome. But we also have tools that drive down emissions within a biotech and pharma's company's supply chain, including ACT, the first eco-label for laboratory supplies, as well as if companies apply My Green Lab certification to contract research. So these are really tools to turn companies' net zero commitments into action on the ground at the lab bench, as well as within the laboratory supply chain. That's why My Green Lab certification was selected as a UN FCCC's breakthrough outcome. They set a goal that 95% of labs across major pharma and medtech companies are My Green Lab certified at the highest level, the green level, by 2030. And we're actually making incredible progress with a number of the largest companies, including AstraZeneca, Novartis, Biogen, setting up programs at a global scale. In fact, a quarter of the companies that we're working with now have Green Lab programs at a global scale. So just want a quick reminder, if you guys aren't familiar with the Race to Zero is a global campaign where members are committed to achieving the same overarching goal, zero emissions as soon as possible, and by 2050 at the very latest. There's been incredible progress and uptake across a number of industry sectors, but it's important, and the UN has established this now, that And I think this is part of the theme of the implementation COP, that we don't just set these long-term targets, we actually have short-term measurable goals that are signs and signals that we're on we're making progress to our overall ultimate target, which is net zero for the entire industry. This industry sector, pharma, has actually achieved 46%, which puts it nearly in the lead for one of the few industry sectors, or nearly in the lead of out of any other industry sector in terms of setting that zero carbon ambition. I want to note this is measured by revenue. So if you look at the number of companies, it's not 46%, but if you look at in total revenue, which is a good sign that the overall market is beginning to shift. And then within that 46%, we actually have significant uptake of companies pursuing Green Lab certification. Last year, we only had 25% of companies within the race to zero starting a Green Lab certification. We now have over 50%, again, with 25% of those companies achieving Green Lab certification at a global scale, and we have a lot more companies committing to the race to zero. So I think this is a really positive sign that this industry can tackle global climate change. So just a quick introduction to what Green Lab certification is. My Green Lab certification is an online self-assessment. It covers 14 different topic areas. It's around 175 questions in total, and it's really a tool to engage researchers on lab behaviors and actions that they can take to be greener. It takes around 8 to 10 months for their certification journey, and it's a true continuous improvement process. So we first assess a baseline. Based upon that baseline, we offer a series of recommendations. Labs have a period of time to implement them, and then we come back and we issue the evaluation again. Labs then come back every 2 years to be recertified, and we're continuously improving the program and in fact raising the bar to make sure that those labs are achieving best practice. Labs are then rewarded with a certification. That certification goes all the way from bronze to green at the highest level, and the UN has actually selected green as the overall breakthrough outcome target. Pretty much any lab can get to gold just through implementing behavior changes. Getting to platinum or green requires significant changes within the organization itself, such as their procurement policies. So it does take a bit more effort and time, but it also drives a lot more impact. Here's a quick sample of organizations that are pursuing Green Lab certification. We actually have over 150 institutions all around the world, some of the best known, largest biotech and pharma companies, including 23 of the top 25 biotech and pharma companies and 10 of the 20 largest medical technology companies. And the program's growing incredibly fast. As you can see from this chart here, we actually have over 1,300 Green Lab certifications in nearly 40 countries. So I mentioned my Green Lab certification is focused on driving down scope 1 and 2 impact, but we also look within the supply chain of laboratories as well. What we found out rolling out Green Lab certification across the world is you can't have a green lab without green products. So we created a product certification called ACT, the first environmental certification for laboratory supplies, equipment. This is the image of the label itself. It's basically a snapshot, a sustainability nutrition facts for products used in the laboratory industry. We look at manufacturing impact, user impact, as well as end of life. And that's totaled up in something that's easy to understand for scientists to make better decisions about the products that they purchase. We actually have over 2,400 labels from some of the largest companies in the space: Merck, MilliporeSigma, Thermo Fisher, Eppendorf, and the program's also growing incredibly quickly too. Just want to mention a couple other ways that you can get involved with My Green Lab. The first is we have a free online tool for any researcher or student or scientist that wants to learn about sustainability called our My Green Lab Ambassador Program. It covers energy, water, waste, green chemistry, and community, and is a quick crash course. We actually have over 2,500 ambassadors in 45 countries, and then we knit that together into a global network and community that meets on a monthly basis. And if you want to go more in depth, we have an in-depth Green Lab accredited professional program, the first credential of its kind to offer scientists an opportunity to grow their knowledge and demonstrate their expertise in lab sustainability. So we're making incredible progress, serving 1,300 labs, but we know conservatively there's at least 265,000 labs globally. We know there's around 10 million scientists, and so we're excited. We're serving 15,000, but that's only a very small percentage of that 15,000. So we know we have to go further and faster. So I'm excited to introduce a campaign very much in line with the Climate Education Hub, where we're working to get scientists to change the dynamics around funding for academic research to drive systemic change and accelerate this movement significantly. The program's called the Million Advocates for Sustainable Science, and I'll let the video do the talking next. You guys, can we play the video? Do I need to click? Oh.
On behalf of My Green Lab and the International Institute for Sustainable Laboratories, I encourage you to participate in the Million Advocates for Sustainable Science letter signing campaign. After my experiences of working more than a decade in academic laboratory research, followed by a decade in the Green Labs field, it is clear to me that if we are going to achieve the large-scale, widespread efficiency, sustainability, and resilience in science that is needed in the face of climate change, then it is essential that those funding research be part of the solution. Research cannot happen without the money, and therefore the money can drive the systematic changes needed. Regardless if you are a researcher or in some other role connected to science, by signing this letter, you are supporting and requesting action by research funders to set expectations for efficiency, resilience, and sustainability in the way scientific research is conducted. Please join us in this movement for sustainable science by signing today.
My name is Christina Griever, and I'm a programs manager with My Green Lab. Sustainable science is my passion, and having worked in labs and experiencing the environmental impact firsthand, as well as supporting a Green Labs program at a university, I know we can do better. I'm going to now walk you through how to sign and, more importantly, share this letter broadly with your community. It's easy for you to join the Million Advocates for Sustainable Science campaign. Visit the website sustainablescienceadvocates.org. For all advocates around the world, besides those that reside in the United States, you'll want to click on the letter on the top, the global letter. For advocates that live within the United States, click on the global letter with U.S.-specific additions. The only difference between these two letters is that the one with U.S.-specific additions has some additional context related to the science funding climate and process in the United States. Once you have reviewed the letter, move down the screen to sign on and support, and then be sure to submit. To make this campaign effective, we will need to build a global network of advocates around the world. So after you sign the letter, even more importantly, please be sure to share it with your friends and colleagues. On behalf of I2SL and My Green Lab, I hope you will join us in creating a movement for change. Together we can create a future of sustainable science and ensure the research enterprise leads the world in addressing the critical environmental issues of our time.
And so just before I bring the panelists back up for Q&A, I want to sum up by how we work as an organization. My Green Lab really offers a suite of tools from the lab bench to the supply chain, from education and advocacy, as well as global campaigns like the UN Race to Zero and the Million Advocates for Sustainable Science to change the industry from the bottom up and the top down. And we know that it actually takes both, and that all of us have a role today to play in building a global culture of sustainability in science. Our 10-year vision is a complete transformation of the scientific community so that every individual in science is fluent in sustainability and understands how they can make a difference through their work and actions, that every lab is green, every laboratory product is designed to minimize environmental impact through a transparent supply chain. We imagine a thriving culture of sustainability in every leading organization in science, and that the science moves from a laggard to a global leader on environmental sustainability. And we believe that science can and should be a demonstration of how to get to zero carbon and inspire the rest of the world's industry sectors to follow in their footsteps. All right, thank you very much. And can we pop it back to the very first slide? Yep. And then we'll bring up the panelists. So thank you guys very much. All right.
Thank you. Thank you, James, so much for this incredible presentation. And if we are saying that this COP is the COP for implementation, I am happy to see the transformation happening, the real transformation that is based on measuring real measurements. It's not only about people or companies committed to actions. It's about taking real actions on the ground. And I'm thrilled about the campaign you mentioned. I do believe that you will create this because we know that you are on the right track, creating the transformation that we need. And to be honest, I'm Egyptian, and having COP in Egypt is something that makes me feel so happy and thrilled that we are having this conversation on the ground. Although I know that this conversation is a bit challenging and advanced, this overall topic is a bit advanced for the region and for Africa, if this is the African COP. But again, this is what COP for. This is to transform and to exchange ideas and energy and work together to see how we can leverage this, as you said, on the global level, engaging everyone with us. So again, thank you so much for this presentation, and we will start with our panel right now. I will start with you, James. You mentioned the pharma companies. I would like to ask you, what are the most important things pharma companies can do to reduce their scope 3 emissions? Because you said that they are already tackling scope 1 and 2. What about scope 3?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'm sure some of my panelists, particularly from Bayer, can speak to this. You know, there's a huge amount of impact within the supply chain, particularly, as I mentioned, with outsourced manufacturing around active pharmaceutical ingredients. Those tend to not be in US and European countries. They tend to be in other regions around the world, and getting a handle and supporting those regions and figuring out how to improve their manufacturing processes is incredibly important. But it also sort of starts upstream. You've got to build a culture of sustainability within your organization so that when you're developing a new treatment and you're scaling up that production, sustainability and green chemistry are part of that mindset from the beginning.
Thank you, James, for explaining this. My other question is to Dr. Christina. Dr. Christina, what are your biggest challenges to achieving your zero carbon ambitions?
Another here. Yeah, thank you. So I'm pleased to say that Bayer is one of the companies that has made a clear commitment to 1.5 degrees by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And yes, you said that we all made these commitments by 2019, and time flies. No, we are 1/3 in, and then you realize, yeah, every year you have to be stringent and you have to reduce. So, I mean, for us it means, in particular, reducing our footprint in scope 1 and 2 around 42% of our operations, and offsetting the rest until 2030, not to net zero, but to the first step. As you said, we take it step by step, and around 12.3% reduction in our scope 3. So now, to put that in context, scope 1 and 2, we can achieve quite a bit by moving to renewable energy, but we will not achieve everything. And examples that show what we need to do internally is really to change completely the way energy flows in our sites. And for example, we have just now a new site for pharmaceuticals formulations that builds on geothermal energy. So it really will use only 30% of what a regular plant would be. Now, Scope 3, as you were saying, that's the interesting bit. And to put a little bit of context, now I give numbers both for the pharma and the agricultural part. Bayer has 100,000 suppliers. That's a number we have, I mean, around the world. Now, of course, some of them will provide services, no? So that's not, they are less impactful, but many of them provide goods and manufacturing. No? That's exactly the areas that you showed, that's the contributors. So now it means working with all these companies as Bayer, but also in platforms like Together for Sustainability to support each other in finding ways to decarbonize. And that's really, it's a complicated work. I don't like the word complicated, but it is, because first you need to find the right way to measure, yeah, and then the right way to reduce and continue reducing while you grow your business. So that's really our challenges. I find it enormously energizing because I feel I can be part of a company that has committed to it, so I can bring my purpose to a scale that I wouldn't be able to do alone. But it's a step-by-step process, and it takes the commitment and the resilience to continue working on that.
That's pretty interesting because you're not only changing how you work, you are transforming the market with all your suppliers, and this is how transformation comes. So it's not only about saying that I'm doing this, I will be involving everyone at the supply chain to be involved in this conversation. So thank you so much, Dr. Christina. My question now for Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I would like to know how are new disclosure requirements in the US and Europe shifting the reporting landscape and data quality?
Thank you. So ICE's analysis of the corporate and financial related climate disclosure rates, the temperature targets, adoption, and emission reduction reporting provide us with optimism. The analysis of the most recent climate data from our carbon emissions data set for 2020 highlights these positive trends. So overall, our analysis of major global investable securities found a 15% increase in public disclosure of climate data by companies. And this rise in climate disclosure rates among companies that were covered not only includes Scope 1 and 2, but also Scope 3 emissions. And even more encouraging is the fact that this improvement has been led by companies providing complete public disclosure for the first time. The disclosure of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions gathered pace in all regions around the world and the major countries that we are able to analyze. And while Europe is still setting the pace when it comes to corporate emissions disclosure and reporting, of note is the improvement in reporting by US corporates, which seems to be gaining momentum. So to answer your question directly, it's not regulatory requirements, at least in the US, that are driving this trend, as the US has yet to adopt any requirements. I want to add that the pace of companies that are setting climate targets has also accelerated in the past few years. We have an analysis of ICE's temperature targets data, and it shows that between 2019 and 2021, there was a 50% increase in the number of companies setting temperature targets. And in addition, the overall number of targets set increased by 65% during this same period. And this is consistent with the findings of SBTI. So tracking then the performance of companies against their targets reveals an equally encouraging trend. We found that companies that with climate targets reduce their intensity at a much faster rate than companies without a target. It's not surprising. It's hard to implement something that you haven't set as a priority. The emission intensity for Scope 1 and 2 for companies with targets was on average reduced by 13.4% in 2020, and for companies without targets, the reduction was just 4.3%. And the similar numbers for Scope 3 emission reveals a 6.1% decline in intensity for companies with a target in 2020, compared to no change in intensity for companies without a target.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. James, correct me if I'm wrong, because I started to feel jealous a little bit. I am in the building sector, and I feel that the sector of the pharma and med tech is a bit faster. Disclosure is taking place much faster than buildings. So please correct me if I'm wrong, and I would also.
Yeah, no, you're actually right, and I come from the building industry. As you know, Amira, we worked together in green building industry before. It's amazing how rapid biotech and pharma has gone from very few targets set to now being one of the leading industry sectors overall. However, I think they also should be leading. I mean, it's an industry sector that certainly doesn't question the climate science like you'll often get in the building sector, for example. And these companies have the resources, the innovation capacity, and perhaps no other industry sector is used to making long-term strategic investments for the betterment of society. So we think that biotech and pharma really should be the leader, and they're appropriately now in their leadership position, and they should be showing the rest of the world's industry sectors how to do it. You know, for My Green Lab certification, we're seeing broad-based, widespread adoption. I think the barrier one is people just don't know about it. So we're on a mission to just tell the world that there's a better way to do science, and that through the adoption of our programs, you can really drive a lot of meaningful impact quickly through low-hanging fruit. The other thing we found, however, is there's sort of an attitude that it's too hard or you can't do it in the laboratory. And I would encourage anybody who questions that or doesn't think it's possible to try one of our free programs, the My Green Lab Ambassador Program or the Freezer Challenge, or implement a Green Lab certification. And I think you'll be shocked to see how much change you can drive and how much low-hanging fruit there is. We're seeing companies implement our program have a 4x return on investment in just 1 year through measured performance savings alone. So I think there's a lot of change people can make if they give it a shot, and nearly every one of our pilot projects turns into a global program.
Thank you, James. I think this will, of course, make the movement go faster. It will advance the movement when people learn more and see pilot projects, because I believe that when people see something on the ground, it's totally different than just hearing about it or reading about it. My other question is to Dr. Christina. After your involvement and engagement with My Green Lab, how you can see it aligned with your strategies?
I do that one. Well, first I will say My Green Lab is involved in our QC and areas, so in quality control. That's what I know so far. But let me give you a little bit of a different perspective of how I look at the whole thing. So for me, really when I talk sustainability and I think of my company, I think for me it's two things. Is how do we do business and which business we do. So, and I think we do the business, so especially in agricultural, in pharmaceutical, we create really societal value. We help in agriculture or the farmers decarbonize their own fields and really contribute to manage the crisis. No, we help provide access to pharmaceuticals to many people around the world, etc. So that's the business that we do. I think it's very important also how we do business. We've been talking about the scope part, and I really like the thought of how do we support scientists in also being part of it. And I was telling James that I get this question actually very often, no? Because we always talk about production. Now our thousands of scientists, no, come and say, well, I want to be part of it. I want to be part of that journey. And I have been reflecting quite a lot about that. And for me, it always has a couple of angles. One is, can you really provide a true contribution to sustainability that is going to be significant and measurable? No? And I think there are paths to that. But second is, how do you engage scientists in being part of the solution, in feeling every day that they are doing something to solve a problem that they see coming? And the energy of scientists is enormous because you are motivated by pure science and by changing things. And I think that's the place where I see the opportunity. Because I think we're doing enough in that space. Scientists are thirsty to be part of solutions because that's what you learn. That's why you become a scientist. So this behavioral change and this providing energy to rally others behind, I think it's a great opportunity for my green labs as well.
Thank you, Dr. Christina. I agree with you. Behavioral change is required, and I think it's capable to transform the market. My question right now is for Elizabeth. Well, Elizabeth, it's related to data. Are investors and banks now using that data like carbon intensity to evaluate their portfolios? And what impact is that having on the companies they invest in?
So by working with the customers throughout the financial industry, including central banks, commercial banks, asset owners, and asset managers, we're seeing increasing demand for the underlying company-level emissions data. Among the drivers is climate stress testing analysis, which is an important risk management exercise for both central banks and commercial banks. And demand for the data for this purpose is gathering momentum as the ECB's groundbreaking work in this area is being replicated by other central banks. By carrying out such an analysis, in order to carry out such an analysis, it requires a significant amount of company-level emissions data. For example, as part of the ECB economy-wide climate stress tests that they performed, ICE provided emissions data for 4 million companies, both listed companies and private companies. And in addition to the central bank's use of this data, asset owners and managers have an increasing interest for both company-level emissions data and climate analytics, such as net zero portfolio alignment analysis. And as the adoption of reporting standards by companies becomes more widespread, both asset managers and asset owners need to have a detailed understanding of the emissions and climate alignment of their investments. But I think it's important to remember that it's not just current emissions that are important, but understanding the likely future alignment for their chosen climate pathway, all the way up to 2050 and beyond that, that is also something that asset owners and managers are interested in. So the data and analytic tools to carry out this analysis are now available through platforms such as the ICE Climate Transition Analytics tools. And then finally, from an investment perspective, demands for emissions data is also changing. It's no longer just specialists in the climate and ESG fund management space that are using our data and portfolio analytics. But as financial organizations adopt climate and temperature targets, that starts to filter down to all the funds under their management. And this means that climate really starts to become an important consideration in the broader investment decision-making process.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Now my question to James is about the benefits that companies get when they adopt my Green Lab certification.
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of benefits. I really appreciate what you had to say about scientists being solution-oriented people, and if you give them the data and give them the opportunity to drive innovation and change, they will do it. And really, our programs are about empowering researchers, giving them the data, giving them the tools and best practices, so that they can make a positive difference. And often, sustainability innovations are also just process innovations. They're a better way to do research. They're a better way to bring that research or that product to market. So we see energy and resource savings. I already mentioned we're seeing a 4x return on investment within 1 year through implementing our program. But the benefits that companies, I think, are really seeing is an alignment of their culture. So they're taking their overall corporate sustainability values and they're getting their entire scientific team being part of that solution and engaging and inspiring them to be aligned with their company's mission. And we can actually have companies measure positive employee engagement scores improve or their employee engagement scores will improve through implementing our program, which has incredible benefits from recruiting and retention to making sure you're getting the next generation of scientists that do care about sustainability. And then it also increases collaboration. We often see it's an opportunity to break down barriers between departments. So the QC department at Bayer that probably never talks to another department may collaborate on Green Lab efforts. And then obviously there's an opportunity for that, for it to help drive carbon reductions in line with an organization's corporate goals and strategies. So there's a market and reputational benefit for pursuing a program that's done in an independent way by a third party.
That's interesting because it's so much aligned with what Dr. Christina mentioned. So when you said that you are going to engage with the suppliers and the supply chain, and this is going to create a transformation, it's same with what my Green Lab will do with companies. So it's not like the higher management will take decisions and prepare reports and that's it. It's about changing the culture, the overall culture of the company, and educating everyone. And again, it's the transformation that we need. Thank you, James, for this. My question right now is for Dr. Christina about what is Bayer doing to engage your supply chain to reduce your Scope 3 emissions. I know that we mentioned, but I need to know more details about it. How do you engage your supply chain?
I had it here. We keep on forgetting that I have that mic. Sorry about that. We do a number of different things, and many of the things we do from their engagement happen through platforms, through business platforms, because at the end, many of the suppliers are suppliers to other companies in the same sector. So it wouldn't make sense that we go today and we tell to do something, and tomorrow Pfizer, Roche, Novartis, somebody else goes and says something that might be the same but might sound a little bit different because we use different languages, we are bound to different reporting systems depending on our geography. So that makes it complex. So there are platforms that have been set up, like for example TFS, Together for Sustainability, that we are one of the founders as Bayer, or PSCI, that's more focused on the pharmaceutical scope, where you support through these platforms, you can help companies also increase overall sustainability standards. And here we will talk about carbon, but we talk about other things, like for example about human rights. Or we will talk about topics like diversity and inclusion of own workforce, etc. So they will give the broader scope of sustainability. Yeah, so to make progress. Another one that we find it's really important is, for example, the use and consumption of water, because it's intimately linked to climate. So these are very effective ways. You don't change things overnight, but you start to change things. And I mean, there are many other things we start to see, and it's really like, which is your willingness at the end of the day to pay a premium price for a lower carbon product if you have the choice. And today, this choice, they don't always really exist. But we hope that with time, companies will be able to develop alternatives so that you can start to choose the lower carbon opportunities. Now, one thing that I want to put here, because I'm an optimist, but it's always, of course, the cost and the investment of that, and that's real, that's there. I'm convinced that investing on sustainability pays off on the longer term, but it also requires an upfront investment of resources that needs to be freed up. And this is something that we companies, we have always on our mind, and that's sometimes why we would like to be quicker, but sometimes you have to select where you go first so that the pace happens. Within a full commitment that 2030 is 7 years from now, basically.
Thank you, Dr. Christina. I definitely understand how much we need to go quicker, and at the same time, without forgetting about the social aspects that you mentioned related to the human right and the inclusivity. Thank you. And my last question for Elizabeth, it's about what do companies need to do to get ahead of the reporting curve?
The message we've been hearing pretty clearly from companies is that they know that they cannot wait for the regulations to be implemented in whatever region or regions that they operate. The pressure is coming from investors, shareholders, potential investors, that they're demanding climate data, and companies are responding. So, investors, as you know, that are based in regions like Europe, they have much more climate regulation than in the U.S. But even absent that, European customers, as a condition for investment, are requiring asset managers to provide detailed climate data regarding their portfolios and their investments, regardless of the specific requirements. And this, in turn, it means that U.S. fund managers are requiring that the companies that they're investing in to provide those reports. So it's clear that being ahead of the curve for reporting can make a company more attractive to a broader base of potential investors, even if climate reporting has not been put into regulation yet.
Thank you. So it's like if you want to be part of the game, you have to do it. It's no longer like something extra. It's not an extra mile. This is something that you have to do to tackle investment. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Now my last question to all the panelists. It's about COP, because COP27 is the implementation COP. Why it is so important to move from the commitment to action, and what was your most important takeaway from COP for this year so far?
Well, yeah, I think, it's exciting, and it's really great to hear the data from you, Elizabeth, that companies with commitments are driving faster reductions. It's really great to see that correlated. I think there was a lot of talk without a lot of action that we heard at COP26, characterized and famously by Greta's blah 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 meme. We got to go from blah 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 to action, and I think now we're talking about action. And I think that's where third-party frameworks are really valuable, because they drive measurable action and they hold everybody accountable to a common goal and target. And I think that's important both for labs and for lab supplies. The other thing that I think that I'm hearing at this COP that really resonated with me was the responsibility of wealthier countries that have made significant carbon emissions historically to the rest of the world. So the moral responsibility, one, to take care of their own footprint and then to help others along the way. I think there's a similar responsibility here in pharma. Pharma is one of the industries that has the most resources, the most capability, the brilliant people, and with that great capability comes significant responsibility. We should be leading, and for those other aspects of the industry that maybe don't have the resources, that haven't yet set targets, there's a responsibility actually for the biggest companies to help them along and to help their supply chain and to work and support them and bring some of their brain power, some of their resources, so that the rest of the industry can come along, because it is a global climate. We can't just do it with one company or one industry sector or one country alone. We have to collaborate, and those of us who have the means to do so need to show leadership, and leaders need followers, and we need to support the rest of the world's companies to follow.
Yeah, for me, it's actually my first COP, so I'm still overwhelmed by the level of activity here and how many people. The things I'm going to take is really three. One is 1.5 has to be written really big and taken really serious. And we know the crisis we have nowadays, the energy crisis, and we cannot deviate from 1.5 because there is no way back. That's the first thing I'm hearing, and we know sometimes there are other voices, but we need to be loud and clear on that. The second part is it's time for action, and we cannot wait for perfection. So I see more openness and willingness to share and to collaborate, because if we wait to perfection and we then make the surprise, whoever it's making, well, you lost the time, because nobody's solving it alone. And the third thing that for us it's really important is that we need to invest in climate adaptation, because part of the damage is done already. Let's not forget it. And many countries, including, I come from Spain, I mean, Spain has changed its climate. It's not the country it was when I was a child. And I guess for many others it's the same. So climate adaptation needs to happen, needs innovation, and needs investment, linked to what you said. And it's the first time that climate adaptation is a clear part of it.
So I think there's probably two things that this is my first COP as well, so been here for a few days, but talking to really the finance community. And we've noticed as the owner of exchanges that the companies who list with us have been very much desiring of training, tools, education around how to set their own goals, their own targets, and their own reporting schedule. And there's the largest companies have gone a long way in this, but there's a whole lot of companies that haven't even started, the smaller companies. And trying to build some of the collaboration that you referred to, James, in terms of how can companies that are further along provide some insight and some learning to companies that are really starting along that path. So hearing some of that from other exchanges around the world that are hearing the same demand from their listed companies, and some of the interesting things that they're doing to provide that type of support and services to their companies was one takeaway. Another is I think I already mentioned it, which is that this is not going to be driven by regulation around the world. It's going to be driven by investors and by shareholders who are demanding that this information be reported, and that companies then meet their targets, and that then companies are the ones who are going to work with their supply chain. So that's it's very clear that we're not talking about whether companies should do that, but really how they're going to do it. I've heard a couple times the past few days that the train has left the station in this phase, so which is good to hear. And then it's kind of a question of, all right, how do we do it, and how do we do it as quickly as possible? I guess I have three things. And then the last thing I was going to mention is, again, on the implementation side of things, that how are we going to, and it's the beginning of the conversation. I think there's a lot more to do. How do you finance the capital improvements that need to be made, whether that's building renewables in developed countries and the global south. It's also adaptation. How do you use the markets to finance all the capital improvements that need to be made, and a recognition that is something we need to do.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, it's my first COP as well, and yeah. And after listening to James, I sometimes feel that I'm a bit afraid that it's going to be blah blah blah. But again, as Dr. Christina said, we shouldn't be looking for perfection. It's time to take action. And as Elizabeth said, this is our space for implementation, to collaborate, and that's why we are whole here. We need to figure this out. We need to know how we can advance this movement forward. Thank you so much for this amazing session, and I would like to thank everyone with us today, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.